Here's a strange thing about modern life. We talk endlessly about compliance, about what we're allowed to say, what we're not allowed to say, what the rules are, and who enforces them. And the way we talk about it assumes the problem is external: the boss, the HR department, the ministry, the algorithm, the surveillance camera, the obvious stuff. But there's a quieter problem, and it's the one Jean-Jacques Rousseau spent his entire life trying to solve. It's the problem of why you obey when no one is watching, not when there's a consequence, not when you'll get caught, but on a Tuesday morning when you could easily do the thing differently and literally no one would ever know. You still don't do it. Why? That's not fear. That's something else. Rousseau's answer, and this is what makes him dangerous to everyone, left, right, and center. His answer is that obedience isn't primarily imposed. It's built into the shape of the society, into the way relationships work, into what you think of as your own voice. Most people know Rousseau for the phrase, "Man is born free, and everywhere he is in chains." It's the kind of line you can put on a poster and feel radical about. But the phrase itself tells you nothing. The real question is what the chains are made of, and how they get inside you without you noticing. And the answer he gave is genuinely unsettling, because it means the thing you think of as your reasonable adult compromise with society, the part of you that says, well, this is just how things work, or you have to be realistic. That voice might not be yours at all. It might be the chains talking. Rousseau starts with a very simple observation. Before society, a human being is concerned with two things: self-preservation and a natural aversion to seeing others suffer. That's it. No morality yet. No guilt. No ambition. Just an animal that wants to live and doesn't like seeing pain. Then society happens, and something shifts. The moment people start living together, a new kind of need appears. The need to be seen, to be valued, to have a position. And this, for Rousseau, is the original corruption. Not power, not money, comparison. He describes it as the moment someone fenced off a piece of land and said, "This is mine," and found people foolish enough to believe them. But the deeper problem isn't the fence. It's what the fence does to everyone else. It creates inequality. It creates the possibility of having what someone else doesn't. And once that possibility exists, the entire structure of human psychology reorganizes itself around it. You stop wanting things because they're good. You want things because they signal something. You stop acting from direct need. You act to maintain or improve your position relative to others. And this is where the chains start being forged, because once your sense of self depends on what others think, you are no longer free. You can't be. Every choice you make is filtered through an audience, even when you're alone, especially when you're alone. The neighbor's lawn, the colleague's title, the acquaintance holiday photos, these aren't just things you notice. They're things that reshape your sense of what's normal, what's required, what's embarrassing, what's acceptable. You adjust, not because anyone told you to, because the alternative feels like invisibility, or worse, like failure. So the first chain is this: you are not pursuing your own good. You are pursuing what other people think is good, because you need them to think well of you to feel like you exist. And here's where it gets weirder, and much harder to see. The obvious solution to this problem is laws. Rules that protect everyone equally so the strong can't crush the weak. And for most of political history, that was the debate. How do we write good laws and enforce them? Rousseau says that's not the solution. That's just a different kind of chain. Because if the law is imposed on you by a ruler, you're still not free. You're just obeying a different master. Even if the master is benevolent, even if the laws are just. The fact that you didn't choose them, that they come from outside you, means you are still a subject, still a child following someone else's rules. So he proposes something radical, something that, once you hear it, you start seeing embedded in the architecture of every institution you've ever been part of. The only legitimate authority, he says, is the authority you give yourself, not individually, not, I will do whatever I want. That's just the state of nature again, the animal impulse. No, the authority has to be collective. Everyone in a society agrees, freely, to be bound by the same rules that they themselves had a hand in making. He calls this the general will, the will of the whole community, directed at what's good for the whole community. And when you obey that law, Rousseau says, you are not obeying an external power, you are obeying yourself, because you are part of the whole that made the law. You are simultaneously the author of the rule and the subject of it. That, he says, is freedom, moral freedom, the only kind that matters. Now, if you are a citizen in a modern democracy, you have almost certainly never experienced this. Not because you don't vote. Voting is the bait. The real mechanism is something else entirely. Rousseau's idea of the social contract isn't about showing up every 4 years and picking between options someone else designed. It's about continuous participation in shaping the conditions of your own life, and that is almost never what's on offer. What's on offer is a pre-written contract. You are born into it. The terms are set. And the primary skill you are taught, from school onward, is how to sign it without noticing you're signing it. Think about the structure of a modern workplace. Rousseau would look at it and see a miniature version of the illegitimate state. The rules come from above. HR designs the policies. The CEO sets the vision. The performance review criteria are handed to you. You didn't make any of it, but you are expected to behave as if you did. Not just comply, internalize, buy in, be a culture carrier, align with the mission. These phrases are not neutral management language. They are techniques for manufacturing the feeling of consent without the reality of it. They're designed to make you feel like you chose the rules, so that when you follow them, you feel autonomous. But you didn't choose them. You were hired into them. And the reason this works is that Rousseau was right about what happens to people in society. You need to be seen. You need to have a position. The workplace offers you a ready-made identity, a title, a salary band, a place in a hierarchy, a reason to get up in the morning. And the cost of that identity is that you have to want what the institution wants, or at least behave as if you do. Over time, the behaving becomes wanting. The gap between your actual desires and the institution's demands closes, not because you've been coerced, but because the alternative, admitting to yourself that you're spending 40 years doing something you didn't choose, is too painful. The social contract was supposed to be something you company author. Instead, you sign it at the door, and this is the pivot point. The thing that makes Rousseau more relevant now than he was in 1762, because the institutions that surround you, the workplace, the school, the platform, the subscription service, the homeowners association, the credit score, the professional license, these are all social contracts in his sense. They are agreements about what you owe and what you're owed, what you can do and what you must do. Who has standing? What counts as a valid complaint? And almost none of them were written with you in the room. That's not a conspiracy. It's a design. The entire legitimacy of a modern institution depends on it feeling like you chose it, while making sure you never actually had the option to refuse. Think about the terms of service you clicked through without reading, the voluntary office social event that isn't really voluntary. The performance metric that was decided 6 levels above your head. The public health guidance you're expected to follow because the science says so, even though you had no part in interpreting the science, weighing the trade-offs or setting the priorities. None of this is tyranny in the old sense. No one is holding a gun to your head. But Rousseau would recognize it instantly. It's the same old trick, dressed in modern clothes. Make people dependent on the opinion of others, then offer them a prefabricated identity that resolves that anxiety, and then call the resulting obedience freedom. The more you look, the stranger it gets, because the places where you feel the most free, the weekend, the hobby, the vacation, the personal brand, these are often just smaller contracts inside the larger one. Spaces of apparent autonomy that are themselves designed to make the larger obedience bearable. You get to choose your furniture. You get to choose your workout routine. You get to choose your side hustle. You don't get to choose the structure that makes a side hustle necessary. The question Rousseau leaves you with is not who is oppressing you. It's much more personal than that, and much harder to answer honestly. He has described a machine. The machine takes your natural desire to be seen and valued, and it turns that desire into a motor that powers institutions you didn't design, for ends you didn't choose, and it does this so smoothly that the motor feels like your own heartbeat. The question is, if the chains are your own voice, how do you recognize them? The gate question was how to recognize the chains when they sound exactly like your own voice. Rousseau's answer is so straightforward that it almost feels like a trick. He says you find the chains by locating the moment you agreed to something you have no memory of agreeing to. Every social contract, legitimate or not, has a founding, a moment when a group of people says, "This is how we're going to live together. These are the rules." In a legitimate contract, you were present, you argued, you voted, you consented. When you obey later, you are obeying a version of yourself. An illegitimate contract hides the founding. It happened before you were born, or it was never a single event at all, just a slow thickening of expectations that no one ever ratified, but everyone now treats as binding. The way Rousseau tells you to test this is not to ask whether the rules are reasonable or whether the institution is well-intentioned. Those are distractions. He tells you to ask something older and far more dangerous. Was I ever actually asked? Not informed after the fact, not consulted on minor details, not handed a feedback form, asked plainly whether I consented to be governed in this way, by these structures, toward these ends. The immediate objection, and it's a fair one, is that this is completely impractical. You can't hold a referendum on every corporate policy. You can't rebuild the state from scratch every generation. Rousseau knew that. He wasn't describing a permanent procedure. He was describing a threshold question about origins. If the founding was never a real act of collective self-determination, then every subsequent rule carries a kind of illegitimacy in its DNA. It might be useful, it might be benign, but morally you owe it nothing. Now take that test and turn it toward your own life. The corporation you work for was incorporated by strangers. The university on your degree was chartered before your grandparents were born. The platform you publish on was dreamed up in someone else's dorm room, funded by someone else's money, governed by someone else's values. The nation you hold a passport for had its founding arguments centuries ago, and even those arguments didn't include most of the people who now live inside its borders. So what did you actually consent to? You didn't consent. You complied. You were born into a machine that was already in motion. The price of refusal, exile, poverty, social death was set high enough that most people never seriously consider it. You showed up. You took the seat. You followed the norms. The machine looked at your compliance and called it consent. And because you have to live with yourself, you started calling it consent too. This is the deepest operation the social contract machine runs. It turns the absence of resistance into the feeling of agreement, and it does it so smoothly that your own internal narration takes over. You tell yourself you chose this path. You were pragmatic. You made the best of a difficult situation. Rousseau would listen to that and say, "That is not your voice." That is the machine, speaking through you, making sure you never feel the weight of what you actually gave away. There is a diagnostic you can use, a way to separate your voice from the machine's. Imagine the founding moment of whatever institution currently shapes your days. Imagine you were there, with equal standing, not as a supplicant, not as a new hire, as a free person among free people. Would you in that room have said yes to these rules, this hierarchy, this definition of what a good life looks like? If the answer is no and you're still inside it, you are not in a social contract. You are in a social arrangement, and the difference is everything. Once you see the difference between a contract and an arrangement, the machinery doesn't vanish. The boss, the inbox, the terms of service, they're all still there. But something shifts in how you hold them. You stop mistaking compliance for agreement. Rousseau would call that the beginning of moral freedom, but recognizing the chains and removing them are not the same operation. The question that follows the diagnostic is unavoidable. What do you actually do? The most obvious answers are dead ends. You can't quit society. Rousseau wasn't a hermit, despite his famous walks. The whole project of the social contract is built on the premise that we are social creatures, and that the problem isn't society itself, but society that has forgotten how to be legitimate. Withdrawal isn't an answer. Neither is the opposite fantasy, burning everything down and starting over. A mob is not a general will. A mob is 1,000 private wills, inflamed, each chasing its own interest under the banner of the collective. Destroying an illegitimate institution does not automatically summon a legitimate one. It just clears the ground. So the real move, the one that fits the framework, is quieter and slower and far more demanding. It's the practice of building small, authentic social contracts inside the larger illegitimate ones. Not waiting for the state to reform, not waiting for the corporation to become enlightened. Starting now with the people you're already in relationship with and asking, what would it look like for us to actually consent to something together? Rousseau gives a very clear set of conditions. A law is legitimate only if everyone subject to it had a hand in making it. The law applies equally to everyone, including its authors, and the law aims at the common good, not at anyone's private advantage. Participation, equality, shared orientation, those three together are what transform a command into something you can obey while remaining free. What's striking is how rarely daily life meets any one of them, let alone all three. But the reverse is also true. You can create a pocket of legitimacy almost anywhere, as long as you can gather a small group willing to actually be in the room. A household that decides together how money is allocated, instead of defaulting to whoever earns more. A neighborhood that organizes its own mutual aid rather than waiting for the city. A team at work that negotiates its internal norms collectively even while the company's broader policies remain external. A group of freelancers who form a cooperative and decide together what rates to charge, what clients to accept, what counts as fair. None of this overthrows the larger arrangement. The corporation persists. The state persists. You haven't solved the problem of illegitimate authority at scale, But you've done something Rousseau would recognize as the essential first step. You've practiced freedom, not the abstraction, not the slogan, the actual, tangible experience of being both author and subject of a rule, in a room with other people doing the same. The machine works by making your own voice indistinguishable from the institution's expectations. It colonizes your internal narration. The only way to break that fusion is to practice hearing your voice in a context where it actually counts, where you speak and the group listens and the rule changes because of what you said. That experience is the difference between being managed and being free. The difficulty arrives when the small legitimate contract collides with the large illegitimate one. Your cooperative sets rates the platform forbids. Your neighborhood group does things the city says require a permit. Your household's financial agreement runs against the tax code. The little freedom hits the big machine, and then you have to decide what comes next. The collision moment is where most people give up. The small legitimate contract you built runs into the large illegitimate one, and suddenly the cost of your little experiment stops being theoretical. The platform deplatforms you. The employer fires you. The state fines you. And the voice that tells you this isn't worth the trouble sounds exactly like reason. Rousseau understood this better than almost anyone. He didn't imagine that building freedom would be easy or safe. What he did understand, and this is the part of his work that people find genuinely unsettling, is that the hardest chain to break is not the external one, it's the part of you that comes to prefer the chain because the chain makes life simpler. You don't have to decide, you don't have to argue, you don't have to hold the weight of collective responsibility. The machine takes all of that off your hands and, in exchange, it only asks for your obedience. For a tired person, that can feel like mercy. There's a passage in the social contract where Rousseau distinguishes between two kinds of freedom. Natural freedom is what you have in the state of nature, the ability to follow your impulses, to take what you want if you're strong enough. Civil freedom is what you gain through a legitimate contract. The right to be governed only by laws you helped create. And then there's moral freedom. That's the one he cares about most. Moral freedom is obedience to a law you have prescribed to yourself. It's the hardest to achieve and the easiest to lose, because it requires something that no institution can give you, and every institution would prefer you didn't have. It requires you to stay awake. The machine's final victory isn't when it crushes your small contract from the outside, it's when you internalize the crushing. When you start telling yourself that the cooperative was naive, that the household meeting was idealistic, that the neighborhood project was never going to work anyway. When you preemptively surrender because you've learned to manage your own hopes downward. That is the moment Rousseau would call the death of the citizen and the birth of the slave. Not the slave in chains, the slave who has come to love the chains because they relieve him of the burden of freedom. The implication, and it's a harsh one, is that the work doesn't end when you create a small legitimate contract. The contract has to be defended constantly. Not just against the external machine that wants to crush it, but against your own exhaustion, your own desire for ease, your own deeply trained instinct to let someone else handle the difficult questions. And here the general will becomes something more than a political abstraction. It becomes a daily discipline. Rousseau talks about the general will as something that must be continually renewed. It isn't a one-time vote. It's an ongoing act of collective deliberation. The moment a people stops actively willing the common good, the moment they become passive, distracted, absorbed in private life, the contract decays. The laws remain on the books. The institutions keep functioning, but the soul of the thing is gone. What's left is an empty shell, an arrangement that looks like a society, but is actually just a management system for people who have stopped being citizens. Apply that to your small contract. You and your household decide together on a budget. The agreement is legitimate at the moment it's made. But 6 months later, someone's circumstances have changed. Someone feels resentful about a decision they didn't fully agree with. Someone is just tired and doesn't want to have another meeting. If you let the agreement fossilize, if you treat it as settled and never reopen it, the contract dies. It becomes another external rule that people comply with resentfully, and resentment is the acid that dissolves legitimacy. Rousseau knew that. A law that is not continually re-willed becomes tyranny, no matter how democratic its origin. So the real question is not just, how do I start a small contract? It's how do I sustain one without burning out, without becoming the person who brings a tedious political process to every dinner table, without turning my life into an endless committee meeting. And that question has no purely theoretical answer. It requires a practice, something embodied, specific, repeatable. Something you can do on a Wednesday afternoon when you're already behind on everything, and the last thing you want is more deliberation, because the machine is counting on that exhaustion. It has structured your time so that deliberation feels like a luxury, and compliance feels like efficiency. The entire architecture of modern work, modern media, modern consumption is designed to leave you too depleted to participate in your own life. That's not an accident. It's the final safety mechanism. Make freedom too exhausting, and people will hand it back voluntarily. Rousseau's answer is not to try harder, it's to build structures that make the ongoing work of freedom lighter, rituals, habits, shared practices that hold the space for deliberation even when individual willpower fails. Here's a practice for this week. It's called the 5-minute founding. Pick one small domain in your life where you currently comply with rules you never agreed to. Not the big ones, not the state, not the corporation. Something close. A shared calendar at work that someone else set up and everyone resents. A household chore division that just sort of happened. A group chat where the norms about response time feel oppressive and nobody ever discussed them. Gather the people involved. It could be 2 people or 5. Say, if we were starting this from scratch right now, with no precedent and no assumptions, what would we actually agree to? Let each person speak. Don't debate yet. Just listen. Then write down whatever agreement emerges, even if it's provisional, even if it's just for 1 week. The point is not the perfect rule. The point is the act of company authoring it. And agree, before you leave the room, on when you'll reopen the conversation to see if it still fits. That second meeting is as important as the first. A contract that never gets re-examined is just a future arrangement waiting to go stale. The whole thing takes 5 minutes to initiate. The follow-through is yours. And the question to hold this week: which arrangement in your life are you most reluctant to examine because the cost of being honest about it feels too high?